Hello, guys. Good afternoon. My name is Arun, and I'm the end user computing specialist, and I'm based in Singapore. I've been with VMware for 3 years, just to introduce myself. And before that, I was with Citrix Consulting, based in Singapore. So I do have some experience in designing and implementing systems both at Citrix as well as VMware. So first of all, thank you so much for joining me today on a Wednesday afternoon and taking 1 hour of your precious time. I'll try to make it as succinct and as elaborative as possible. And if you have any questions, do type in the chat window and I'll happy to unmute you and we could have a conversation, okay? So any point in time, please, feel free to stop me and we could dive a little deeper if you wish to, right? It's a very broad topic. So I try to summarize and take a particular use case to share with you, and we could take it from there. Okay. So shall we begin? So let's start. Okay. So the agenda is like this. So we first look at the overview and the methodology of how to design Workspace ONE with Horizon. We look at the approach we take and we look at certain components. The emphasis of this particular webinar is around Horizon, which is the virtual apps and the desktops piece of the product. While Workspace ONE is a very broad solution and it has Workspace ONE UEM, it's got IDM and so on and so forth. This session would be very centered around Horizon, okay? But the first section, which is overview and approach, would talk about the suite as such, okay? Okay, before even we talk about technology, I think it's really, really important to look at the business drivers and the use case requirements. While Workspace ONE is a suite of products, right? Each of those products has got very specific functionality and very specific needs that it could address. So we got to be very clear on what's the business outcome we are delivering out of it and what's the driver that actually have the project in the first place, right? So discovering the business driver and use case is super important, right? So we do have a methodology which takes you and which tells you exactly on how to do that. And that's what I want to first introduce you, okay? The first thing we need to do is why is there a project in the first place? What's a key driver, right? That question is very, very important because most often we kind of talk to the desktop teams and the IT operations teams and not really to the businesses in most cases. So it is very important for the business to understand what is it that IT provides and whether it's security, is it functionality, whether it's something else. It is very important to understand what is the key driver there. Once you establish the key driver, you got to go a level deeper to understand, what use cases are we actually doing? There could be 8 to 10 use cases that a particular business driver could result in. Which one are we picking? And who else is the end user? A bunch of questions around it. We pick the use case for the project based on your timeline requirements, budgeting requirements, and the urgency of the whole project. So if you don't establish this thing, we will not be able to demonstrate sufficient progress in the direction of a business driver. So it is super critical for us to nail down the use case, right? Once use case is established, the next step is actually to go and look at the requirements to address those use case. The requirements could be functional or it could be technical. So a functional requirement could be you will have to be able to use a particular core banking application in a certain way on a certain device. That's a key requirement. That's a functional requirement, right? A technical requirement would be that, hey, all traffic should be encrypted, all right? Things like that. So we narrow down on the business driver and then further establish the use case, then derive the functional and technical requirements. Once a requirement is there, we kind of, ask a question, how do we best address this requirement? For example, if the requirement is around data protection and DLP, right, could we just address it using a sandbox solution on a mobile device? Or do we need to do a virtual application? Or do we need to have a physical desktop with certain a DLP host software in it. So we identify the right solution, and once the solution is established, you go back to the use case and see whether this particular solution is acceptable to the target audience, and move from there. Then comes the actual implementation and the design and the implementation of it. So this could be done by a partner, or it could be in-house, or it could be our consulting services, which is a PSO. And after we design and build the solution, we further validate whether it fits a use case and delivers on the business driver. And then it's rolled out to the day two operations, right? Which could be a partner or the customer itself. So each of those phases needs a sign-off in a typical scenario. And the whole point about a milestone sign-off is to make sure that we do not deviate from a core goal of delivering business value, right? And for this, in the next 1 hour, what I'm actually trying to do is that I'm going to be very, very specific on one use case that I'm recently working on. And I'm going to narrow the conversation into that. The reason being that Workspace ONE being a very broad product, this discussion we could have for the whole day, and we still wouldn't cover that much of ground. So for the convenience of this audience and taking into consideration that we have just 1 hour, I'm going to be very specific. I'm going to use the same methodology that I'm currently using with a customer of mine, and then look at how do we derive a solution to it, right? And I will share the video, the links, etc. And you could adapt that particular methodology and fit it into your particular requirement. Okay. So does that sound good? So in this case, I'm actually working with a customer in the regulated in a regulated industry. I don't want to name the customer or the industry. The only thing I want to mention here is it's highly regulated. They have audits, they have compliance requirements, and they are very, very sensitive about users' productivity. So the key business driver for them is to make sure that the data doesn't leak out of Singapore. So that was how the project came forward. So we were talking to the desktop operations team, and the desktop operations team was actually consulting with the security team, and they said that one of the key requirements that they want VMware to solve is the data locality. Data should never leave Singapore, and they do have certain use cases around it. There were many use cases. One was internal employees, and the other one was some of the VIPs who travel to different places. But for this project, we actually picked up a use cases, which is contract developers in India. So this particular company is based in Singapore, and they do develop a lot of software in-house, and they do outsource to certain vendors in India. While it is a very cost-effective solution to do that, it also means that there is a very high probability, if it is not managed well, for the data to be leaked outside Singapore, and that's definitely not something that they want. So with the use case we picked in this case was contractors from India, and we were talking about 3,000 to 5,000 contractors. Okay, then we were like, hey, okay, so we identified a contractor as a use case. Then what do you need for that contractor? So we look at the profiles of those contractors. It turns out that the majority of these are developers. So they develop tools, mobile applications, they do web applications, Windows applications, and they do have Visual Studio and so on and so forth, Java IDE and all that. So the end user here is actually a developer who's actually developing software on those IDE machines, right? So we went ahead and said, hey, okay, so this is my end user, and I have a specific set of requirements of what they want. Now, what is the right solution to do that? We then figured out that, hey, because it's so security sensitive, it is important that one particular developer who works on a certain project should not have access or should not have any visibility into what the other team of developers are using, because they could be working on a totally different project. So we thought that a good way to deliver IDEs or integrated development environments to them is through via Horizon VDI. And we could further enhance security using NSX. So that's the solution that we identified. So in order to build it and design it, one of the biggest design constraints were around disaster recovery and availability. So we suggested a multi-site active passive sort of a design, and we initially proposed professional services from VMware, and they will probably engage them. We are still talking to them. And probably with them, they would have a partner also to do that. Once it's rolled out, the in-house teams takes responsibility for the whole project. So this is a live example of how we were establishing milestones for every single phase, right from a business driver perspective to the day-to operations perspective, and through emails and meetings, we were able to establish the requirements at every milestone, to actually divide roles and responsibilities between different people, so that we don't blame each other when things go wrong. We clearly knows who owns what and what's the overall end goal. Okay, so this is a live example of how we follow this methodology. Okay. So I just want to summarize the whole requirement in one slide problem, in just one slide. So this is one slide problem statement. So just to reiterate, the end users are in India and they are contract developers. The key driver and data security requirement is no data should leave Singapore, right? That means that your client drive mapping is disabled, your USB is disabled, clipboard mapping is disabled, all of that stuff. With regards to disaster recovery, our RTO was about 1 hour, which means that if there is a data center loss, let's say there's a power outage, the developers lose connectivity for an hour, within which they get their environment back up. And in that environment, RPO is 6 hours. So 6 hours is basically means that he only at max he loses 6 hours of his work, otherwise or lesser. So that's the thing. So these two are a very, very important design consideration. There is a direct cost implication if you get one of these wrong. So RTO is recovery time objective, and RPO is recovery point objective. So recovery time objective just means how fast can you get the service up and running, and RPO, basically recovery point objective, is that how much data do you lose in the event of that thing going down, right? So the other big requirement they have around functional, other than the functionality, is that they had emails, and that emails had OST cache. So if you have large inboxes, that would mean that you have to download the entire inbox into the machine. So if you're using stateless desktops, that means that every time that gets downloaded, there is an adverse impact on your network bandwidth, there is an additional load, and so on and so forth. So that was one of the functionality requirements. Further to that, there is also a requirement for the developers to personalize the desktop. So they could add certain nodes to them. They could customize their IDE. They could customize their windows as such to suit their personalization needs. They could create shortcuts. They could change wallpapers. There's a degree of freedom that we allow them to do. While the desktops are stateless, it also means that you should not give them you should still allow them to do a certain degree of customization, right? The other big requirement they have was that users are not in the corporate network. That means that they would either come via internet or via VPN. So connecting via VPN was proposed, because I'm not a big fan of connecting via internet was proposed, because connecting via VPN is not an ideal solution, because VPN has a certain overhead, and we do have certain technologies like a unified access gateway, which helps you to secure the connections via internet, right? Rather than digging a tunnel right from India to Singapore. The other factor that we considered is that, hey, do you want these developers to have mobile applications and web applications? So that was we were told that you don't need to have that at this phase, right? So this is basically one slide tells you the problem statement. And before I go further, here's Mohammed who's got a question. So let me unmute him. Hey, Mohammed. Good afternoon. How are you doing? Mohammed, I'm unmuting you. Angie, can we unmute Mohammed?
Yeah, I'm trying to. Not working.
Uh,
Not working. Muhammad, you can type your question in the chat box as well.
Sorry, Mohammed. I was trying to unmute you, but it looks like uh, the software doesn't allow me to do that. Mohammed, feel free to type your question here. Okay, so while we wait for Mohammed, just a comment. So, is this use case a very valid use case in your environment? Is this something that you commonly see, and is it a good use case for the next 45 minutes? What's the general feedback? You could just type it in there in the chat box. Okay, so let's proceed. We do have certain architectural principle and concepts around which we design the whole Workspace ONE solution. And this is a very elaborate document, and there's a very, very good guide to do that. So the reference for the guide is actually right on the slide. So I'll be sharing the slides after this, so you could go there and learn more about it. We kind of design based on four key pillars. One of the biggest pillars that we design is around scalability. So UC project starts with a big bang, right? So it always starts with a small group of users. It could be 100, in some cases 500, 1,000, and then it could go to the entire organization. So in this case, we were looking at uh, you know, we were looking at a scalability for that environment to scale ultimately up to 5,000 users. So that was one of the biggest considerations. So when you're talking about 5,000 users, we have to look at cloud pod design. You need to have multiple pods and so on and so forth. The other thing is availability. So availability is basically saying that, of the many components in the solution, which component, no, there should be no single point of failure. It should be very transparent to the service that's been offered, and the user should never know about it. So that's the other thing. The third thing is site redundancy. There's a direct cost impact to it. So what if the whole data center goes down, right? So that's a very important consideration. The fourth one is replication. And this is directly related to Rajan's question about the RPO, right? So every stack needs to be replicated to the other side in order to make sure that the service is running. So Rajan has a question which says, I guess 6-hour RPO is much more since we have RPO as 1 hour, and we believe it could be reduced to 2 hours, right? Yes, Rajan. I mean, I completely agree with you. This customer is willing to do a 6-hour RPO, but I've got customers who has a much more stringent RPO requirements. RPO just means that how much data can you afford to lose when the service comes back. I did not say that how much data you can afford to lose, right? So while a data center goes down, the data is essentially not lost, okay? It needs time to be recovered, right? RPO is not that. RPO is about when the service comes up, when the user gets a desktop, how much of data is there when he resumes the service. That was 6 hours. If you want to have a data RPO of less than 6 hours, let's say 1 hour or 40 minutes or even zero, it's just a function of how you replicate. So the only way to do RPO zero replication is storage replication, which is asynchronous replication. So what that means is that if you have a file server and that file server has all your data, your profiles, etc., that has to be synchronously replicated from site 1, which is production, to DR at all times. So when the service comes up in site 2, you immediately get the exact same data or exact same file that you saved in site 1. That function, I guess, is a matter of cost and how you implement. If you so synchronous replications solutions are quite expensive, right? So you could replicate with cheap solutions like DFSR or other asynchronous solutions, which are very reliable. That gives you an RPO of probably 1 hour or 1.5 hours. But a real-time synchronous storage replication technology is typically very expensive, right? So there are certain cost considerations associated with it. But and to answer your question, we could have RPO to even zero. The design caters for that. So I feel that that's not a constraint. It's just about how much of hardware can you invest. So Rajan, did I answer your question? Okay, so let's. So these are the 4 considerations that we will be looking at, and then with that, let's go to the component of design. Okay, so this is a slide for Workspace ONE. So Workspace ONE, as you know, is a suite of products, and it's not just one. It's an umbrella, right? So we've got for identity, we've got VIDM, which could be either on premises or it could be in cloud. You have Workspace ONE UEM, which could also be on premises or it could be in cloud. You have intelligence, which is purely a cloud service and which actually aggregates data across all the devices and all the applications and mobile apps and so on and so forth. Then you have Horizon, which could be in the cloud, and App Volumes, which delivers real-time applications, and Management Manager, Unified Access Gateway, which is a reverse proxy to front-end everything. So there are multiple components. So let me ask you a question. Which of these components are actually required for this particular use case that we talked about, contractor use case, so on and so forth. So in the chat window, I would really love you to type in whether this is required or not. So let me ask you a question. Is Workspace ONE UEM required for our particular design? Yes or no? Workspace ONE UEM SaaS, is it yes? Okay, is it SaaS? Yes, yes. Okay, I've got 2 yes. Ismail seems to be correct. Actually, no. Because if you look at my earlier slide, it says that we do not need mobile at the moment. So while it could be in the future, at this point in time, we don't need it. So we don't require this particular service. So you don't need SaaS. You don't need on-premises also. So let's come to the next one. Do you need a VMware Identity Manager for this project? Yes or no? So Rajan says yes. Ismail says yes. How about the others? Rishi says yes. Edgardo says no. It turns out that there is no reason for an identity manager because it's a contractor. So we are not trying to have a single sign-on on your phone, on your web application, and so on and so forth, right? So there's very little relevance to that. We may have that in the future for other use cases, but in particular to the business driver, you don't need that. What about the next question? Workspace ONE Intelligence. Basically, it polls your end devices. It actually aggregates data from your mobile applications and all that, and it tracks your login. Do you need that component? So Christopher says no. How about Ismail and Mohammad and Edgardo? Rishi. So what do you think? Rajan says, Raza says no. Rishi says yes. For this particular use case, again, the answer is no. So again, we are very specific to what use case we are solving. So we don't need that. How about Horizon? Do you need Horizon? Yes. Yes. So yes, that's a very obvious thing, right? Okay. So inside Horizon, do you think that Horizon Cloud is on Microsoft Azure is required? So this is actually tricky because the reason is that I did not talk about why we did not choose cloud, Microsoft Azure Cloud. So I did not cover that. So it's a very unfair question. So in this particular for this particular customer, we are not doing public cloud, we are doing on-premises. So the solution that we are currently doing for this phase one, among the entire suite of products and the design components, we are sticking with Horizon 7, App Volumes, and UEM and Unified Access Gateway. So where I'm going to specify is that while we may be tempted to use the entire suite of products, when you actually do designing solutions, we have to keep that in mind that in the future we need to be able to expand to others, but for the specific use case, we stick with the components we have, right? So I also said that we're going to have a recovery service blueprint, which basically means that how does the whole service looks like from a user standpoint. So on the left is you have a user using a client, and that particular user always connects to one site. The reason why it's called active passive is because as far as a user is concerned, he always connects to site one. And he will only connect to site two when there is a disaster. But if you look at from an infra standpoint, it's not active passive, it's actually active active. The reason being that the infra on site 2 is always running, up and running. And both of them are connected via a cloud pod architecture, right? From a user span standpoint is active passive, but from an infra standpoint is always active active. So this is one of the core concepts of Horizon, where we actually look from an end user standpoint. And we always recommend 2 active services from an infra standpoint. So if you look at the different components, you would know that I'm actually using instant clone or a link clone. So I would have one particular master image for all my users. It could be a Windows 10, 1903 or 1709 or whatever is an image that is certified by the business. And in that, what we do is that we layer this particular image with certain applications delivered via AppStack. And the reason why we do that is because different developers could have different application profiles. Some could be using Java tools, some could be using Visual Studio tools. So if you're trying to build multiple base images, you're going to have many base images to maintain. So single image management becomes, cannot be realized. So when you have an app stack which only caters to Visual Studio, that could be provisioned to all Visual Studio developers, while you have another app stack for Java developers, and that could be so on and so forth. Let me ask you this. Well, why do you think that I have writable volumes? Is there any reason that you think that there is a writable volume required in this thing? The answer is there, in my earlier slide, if you remember. So what's a use case here for a writable volume? Anyone? Okay. So the reason why we said writable volume is because writable volume is basically a component of app volumes, which allows you to write data to it, right? That's exactly right. So Rajan said the right thing. So in our business requirements, right, we had mentioned that writable volumes, one of the business use cases is that users have OST, right? So let me go to that slide. So it says that here, users have OST cache. So let's assume that you have a 20 GB email cache. So if you do not have writable volumes, what ends up happening is that if you use an instant clone, every time a new VM gets boot up, it pulls down 20 GB from Office 365, which is the email in this case. So our writable volume stores that cache inside this particular, it's because it's read-write, it stores here. So that's one of the key use cases for writable volume. The other thing is that we have profiles and user settings. So this is the component which actually helps in keeping personalization data, right? So if you actually look at the solution, we address the requirement to have 2 data centers out of redundancy. We also have addressed the requirement to solve some of the business needs. And now what we have to concentrate to do is that, hey, of all these components, right, how do we make sure that it's fully available Each of these components have availability, redundancy, and performance, right? So those are the things that we have to make sure that it's there. So let's look at the basic design. So Horizon is a very easy design to understand. So basically from a Horizon client, you directly connect to the connection server, which is basically a broker. You log in with your Active Directory credentials, go to the connection server and say, hey, connection server, my name is Ismail Rahman. Can you tell me which desktop I'm eligible for? And the connection server will return you a desktop, and you go directly to the desktop. So that's how it happens. So this is a very simple, process where, and this whole step is called brokering. And everything is stored in Active Directory. Your entitlements, your user accounts, even your connection server database is on LDS, Light Directory Services, which is a Windows role, which connects very closely, which connects to the Active Directory, right? So, however, for this particular use case, users are coming from India, and they have to be terminated somewhere else, right? They cannot be let into the customer's data center, in which case you need to have a reverse proxy. That particular reverse proxy in Workspace ONE is called Unified Access Gateway. In this example, we are actually having Unified Access Gateway for Horizon, but in the future, when you have other components like Workspace ONE UEM and Content Locker and so on and so forth, you could use UAG to be a reverse proxy for those services as well. So the only difference here is that the client coming from India terminates at the UAG, which is in the DMZ, and then from there you go to connection server, and then Rajan Maharajan, he says, hey, who's the desktop? Which desktop should I connect to? And he's been given the same, he's been returned with the connection to go to. But the key difference here is that instead of him going directly, he connects to the UAG, which actually reverse proxies via Blast Extreme into the internal network. So this is a way to secure the traffic. So the whole connection here is all encrypted. This is AES encryption, and this is all SSL. All the connections are encrypted, right? The other thing that we have to understand is, what do you mean by a block and a pod? So does anyone know what's a full form of a pod? So we say that Horizon has Horizon, pod, and block, right? So what's a full form of a pod? POD. Anyone in the chat window? So a pod is nothing but a point of delivery. So what that actually means is that, hey, it's one place where I deliver services. That's all what I mean, right? So pod is the overarching, I would say, the big unit, right? A point of delivery, right? So inside a pod, there are multiple blocks, okay? So each of those blocks, blocks are of two types. One is a resource block and one is a management block. So what does a management block do? So management block does all the management stuff: connection brokering, SQL, application settings, UEM settings, and so on and so forth. How about the resource block? So resource block actually is the one who actually does work, right? So it actually, there's a lot of compute requirements. There's a lot of memory churn, etc. Because the users land on the resource block. The users only go to the management block to get brokered or get entitlements and so on and so forth. After that, he is redirected to the resource block. So resource block is a guy who actually carries the weight, right? So in our use case, we have a requirement of 2,000 users, which could expand to 5,000 users, which means that if you size the pod to be 2,000 users, I need multiple. If you size the block to be 2,000 users, I need two blocks. So 2,000, 2,000, it could be 4,000. And perhaps if I want some more redundancy, I may, if I want to expand, I need another block. And the whole thing, but while every 2,000 users could be considered as a block, we just need one particular management block. and that particular management block could be, shared across different blocks, right? So that's pretty much how a block and a pod works. So Christopher has a question. Is Horizon 7 pod different from its cloud pod architecture? No, it's exactly the same. So a cloud pod architecture is basically an architecture which connects the user to different pods. So when you have pod 1 in Singapore, pod 2 in Malaysia, pod 3 in Indonesia, if you want a user to access one particular URL called vdi.company.com, based on my location, I could be redirected to my Jakarta pod or a Singapore pod or a Bangkok pod, right? That particular whole architecture is called Cloud Pod. Basically, Cloud Pod is a collection of Horizon 7 pods. So it's not different. So it's inclusive, right? So Imran has raised his hand. Hi, Imran. I think Mohammed, yeah, you can talk. I think you are unmuted.
Okay, everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Actually, I joined later on a few minutes and I just had some views. I was just being curious that at the end of this slide and presentation, do you have any running test live environment so we can see it all happening in the system or in the setup? Do you have that at the end of slide?
So, not the end of slides. I could, if you can send me an email, I could send you a hands-on labs link where you can learn about all these concepts. And end of the slides, we do have certain references on further reading and how it actually works. So I could guide you on that. No problem.
Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
No worries. Okay. Mohammed Imran could be unmuted, so I have to learn how to unmute others also. Okay, so let's proceed, right? Now, there was a question from Christopher about Cloud Pods. Cloud Pod is basically aggregation of all pods. Today, Horizon 7.9 has released, but these are 7.8 limits. So which basically means that, Christopher, you can have up to 50 pods connected via Cloud Pod, and each, there could be 10,000 sessions per pod. And it's a massive scale, right? So we do have a customer who's around 200,000 sessions. So this actually scales a lot. Okay, so I'm skipping this slide. These are very specific sizing best practice instructions. What's been tested, what's not been tested, how many instant clone VMs if you on a pod, which is 8,000. If you're using link clones, it's 4,000, and so on and so forth. So these are basically numbers, all right? The most important thing when you consider a resource block is that a resource block is demarcated by a vCenter server. So why a vCenter server, right? The reason why you need a vCenter server for every resource block is because vCenter does a lot of work in Horizon architecture, especially when you're doing instant clone. So if you look at typical data center workloads, vCenter, once it provisions and configures DRS, it's not actively engaged. That's not the case in the case of when you talk about VDI. In a VDI, every single time a user launches, you kind of vCenter is really busy spinning off desktops, and every time a user logs off, user deletes a desktop. The vCenter deletes a desktop. vCenter is really busy, so it is a very good idea to make sure that the pod actually fits within the vCenter limits of 3,000 or 4,000 or 2,000, whatever that is. I typically like to keep a resource block to 2,000 users. That being the reason being that app volumes performs really well at 2,000. After which it's still okay, but I want to make sure that everyone's have enough resources, right? So that's one of the resource considerations. Right, a cloud pod is actually connected. So a pod is usually, while you can have multiple pods in the same city, what we typically find is that pods are distributed across across geographies. That's the reason why I said it's cloud pod. So one of my customers has got 2 pods in Singapore, one in London, and one in New York. So when his users fly to US, he gets connected to a URL called vdi.company.com, and that gets redirected to US, right? So as you can imagine, latency is very, very big consideration for a VDI environment, and CloudPod helps you to solve that, right? The only thing you have to make sure that in CloudPod is the data replication in place. When I say data replication, what do I mean? I'm not talking about virtual desktops. That's not data. That's not user data, to be exact, right? So I'm talking about profile data. I'm talking about users' files. It is very annoying that you go to another country and find that none of your files are there. So that's where you'll need to make sure that the replication technology, especially around UEM and folder redirection, are in place. All right. I want to be very, very clear on one thing that is unsupported here. Of late, there have been a lot of customers wanting to do stretch clusters. While stretch cluster is a great idea, I want to be very clear and candid saying that we do not support stretch clusters for Horizon connection servers. You could potentially stretch other components like the resource pool, virtual desktops, and UAG, and so on and so forth, but you can't stretch connection servers. The reason being that the connection server here on site 1 and site 2 are one single group, right? Or belong to a single group. And they communicate through Java messaging services, JMS. So JMS is extremely latency sensitive. The moment JMS goes, JMS has any problems in terms of connectivity, so that's very sensitive. So we kind of don't support having connection servers in multiple sites. Right. However, what you can actually do is have all the connection servers on one site and stretch that particular cluster across the second site. Right. In this case, the advantage that you have is you just need to reboot site 1 and it powers on site 2. Right. But having said that, this is just highlighting that we can actually do stretch clusters, which means that also it doesn't need to be cloud pod. Right. So when you're talking about cloud pod, pod 1 and pod 2 are totally different, totally independent setups, whereas a stretch cluster is not. The vSphere cluster in site 1 is stretched to site 2. So in this particular example, I've chosen to do cloud pod architecture and not a stretch cluster, but stretch cluster is also possible. Okay. So the next component that I want to highlight is app volumes. So the way app volumes work is basically it captures all the applications as a VMDK. And the app volume agent mounts it only when the user logs in at login time, right? If the app volume is assigned per user and not computer, right? So it's very simple. User logs in, the agent gets Active Directory information. It goes to App Volume Manager and says, hey, App Volume Manager, can you please load a volume? If the user has writable volume, that particular volume is also loaded, right? And app volume has certain scalability and sizing limitations and recommendations. So if you're having a setup of 2,000 users, 2 app volume managers are more than enough. The key consideration here is number of logins per second. Right. So app volume supports it takes about half a second for one user to log in simultaneously. So if you have 100 of 2,000 users, if you have 100 users logging in suddenly at a split of a second, you potentially have them queued over 10 to 15 seconds. So that's a consideration you have to take care. But that's rarely the case because users log in at different times, even if they try their best to time themselves, right? But that's one of the considerations. So it's a good practice to keep app volumes, though it scales quite a lot to 2,000 users, right? In app volumes, unlike Horizon Connection Server, you need a SQL database. And when you have 2 sites, you could have SQL on site in site 1 and site 2, no problem. So that's perfectly all right. So the entitlements of app volumes needs to be replicated across site 1 and site 2 if the SQL is separate. Alternatively, what you can do is you could have SQL Server in one site and have a SQL always on also to replicate. That's also possible. SQL is one thing, but the key concept is what happens to my app stack. If I change app stack in site 1, will it be replicated? So the way to replicate is we have a non-attachable LUN that we put it as a part of the storage group in app volume 1 and storage group in app volume 2. So a storage group is nothing but a collection of app volumes where when you make a change to one volume, that particular change gets replicated to the other volume. So in this example, site 1 has a storage group which has got data store 3, data store 1, and data store 2. There are 3 data stores. So when you make a change to any app stacks on data store 1, that gets replicated to data store 3. The same data store 3 is also a part of a storage group in site 2. In this case, if you actually change something in data store 4, the same change gets cascaded into data store 5 and data store 3. So this way, any change you make in site 1 or site 2 gets replicated to data store 3, after which it will replicate to the other sites. This is how you replicate abstracts, right? Writable volume, writable volume, unlike abstract, is much harder to replicate. So the reason being that writable volume is a read-write volume, a data store. So, how do you make sure that when an object is being written, how do you replicate at real time? The answer is you can't. That's the reason why the option to replicate app volume is a manual or scheduled, which means that at any point in time, right, at certain time intervals, you back up, you schedule a job to back up and replicate writable volume. So that's a very important thing. In this particular example that we say, I do not, we use writable volume as a cache, like Rajan mentioned, right? Which means that I'm only using it for email OST files. So once you log in, the email gets down, the OST, the mailboxes get downloaded as OST file into that writable volume LUN. So after which, even if the LUN is lost, no problem. It can again get repopulated, right? So it's basically a cache, right? So in the case of app volume multi-site service, you gotta, as we discussed, the app volume manager needs to be replicated based on entitlement, right? It could be a SQL replication here, or it could be a manual script to replicate these configurations. Mind you, there is very little change that administrator to makes on a daily basis on app volumes. So it's not a lot of change we are talking about here. Whereas abstracts and writable volumes need more automation because, abstracts are, during day 2 operations, you may always find someone actually changing stacks, recreating new stacks, and so on and so forth, right? So that's one part of it. Next comes user environment manager. So what's user environment manager? So user environment manager is basically those things that will help you to save your profiles, your personalization changes, your shortcuts, and so on and so forth, right? It's actually an SMB drive that you have stored somewhere on your file share. And you can replicate at your based on your RPA requirements. So based on so UEM has multiple components. So the first component is UEM Environment Manager Console. So this is basically, it doesn't even have a database. What it tries to do is that it reads a config file, which is a read-only file for the user, read-write file for the admin, that it reads the settings from, right? So you kind of connect to this file and change configurations, right? UEM is actually a policy which you need a AD GPO, to link it. After which all the configurations are loaded at real time, and that's stored in the profile archive share. So these are the 4 components. So what is a profile archive share? So profile archive share is basically an SMB drive, which is / your profile share / documents and settings / username / wherever that particular personalization data and profile data is actually stored in your profile archive. And this gets connected every time the user logs in. It loads a mandatory profile first, and then this gets only pulled down when a particular application is used and a particular profile is required. So it's very dynamic in nature. So in our reference architecture, instead of using a costly replication technology, we've actually used DFSR and DFSN. So DFSN is DFS namespace, which basically means that if I have a particular FQDN, if that particular FQDN share which hosts that FQDN goes down, DFSN will automatically point to another store, right? So that replication happens through DFSR. So DFSR currently did not support an active-active setup. So it's basically active-passive. So you could configure policies for 45 minutes or 1 hour or 30 minutes based on Microsoft recommendations. So DFSR and DFSN best practices, my suggestion is that if you're going to host your own file servers, use Microsoft best practices to host that. As far as VMware is concerned and Horizon Desktop is concerned, when a site goes down, another site comes up. The only thing we do is we read from that particular UNC path, and as long as it's there, we are good to go. Right? So the IT configuration and the replication technology is what I said. So when you're in a cloud pod, you could have a pod in America, a pod in EMEA, a pod in APAC, and all of them are replicated using DFSR and mapped using DFSN, right? So in the case of UEM, what I typically recommend is if the pods are close in nature, I believe that there is no requirement to actually load the profile from the respective sites. You could potentially read from a single profile store. That means that you will have an active-passive design for your DFSR, and you'll always read from one file share. So in the event that this particular site 2 is down, it automatically DFSN will point to this particular file share, and you're good to go, right? Based on your RPO, which is maybe 40 minutes or 30 minutes, whichever that is, right? One of the very critical components that I want to highlight is Unified Access Gateway. The reason why it's very critical is because you would have heard about F5 reverse proxy. Our current recommendation is not to use F5 for reverse proxy. So we used to have F5 LTM and APM. So instead of APM, our recommendation is to use Unified Access Gateway. One really good feature that I like about Unified Access Gateway is that it allows, it comes day one support for the latest releases of Horizon, and is also certified on the latest enhancement of Blast Extreme. So a third party or an independent vendor like F5 would probably take 6 to 9 months to offer certification for the new Blast Extreme or the new Horizon version that's coming in. UAG doesn't have a problem because every Horizon release that goes out is certified in the lab by Horizon, by VMware. The other thing is that when you log a tech support call and if there is an issue, UAG being a component of VMware, it's so much easy to troubleshoot and everything is good, right? So, previously we had something called security service. We don't have that anymore. That totally goes away, and we say that we should have UAG now. So this basically addresses the requirements that I just talked about. This is how. So in my design that I mentioned, I have UAG. I've got Horizon Connection Service. I've got 2 pods. It's active passive. I've got vSAN, I've got UEM, I've got app volumes, I've got writable volumes so I kind of address all the use case. In the future, I may have to integrate this particular solution with the other solutions like Workspace ONE UEM, Horizon Cloud on Azure, Workspace ONE Intelligence. So this is the end goal and end state, but currently we are not doing it. We are actually doing on premises, right, and one component. So this particular architecture that we mentioned is expandable, right? It could be extended, right? So this one is a cloud based architecture, and this one is the on premises, right? So that's all I had for today. I think I'm right on time. So I've been very cautious about to cover everything. So Imran had asked about some reference links, etc. All the reference links are on this particular page. But what I actually like are the videos. The videos are really cool. I think is much easier, right? You could be on your, I travel by train, so I see a lot of videos on YouTube on train, right? So you could use one of those videos to educate yourself, right? The other big thing that I thought was really useful is hands-on labs. So Mohammed, please, Mohammed Imran, please feel free to reach out to me. I will send you a hands-on lab where you can play with yourself. You get a system and you can configure CloudBoard and stuff like that. So with that, right, I've got a couple of minutes. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. If it's not, you can still email me at apc@vmware.com. Right, my address is right there on this slide. APC America Penang China @vmware.com. And I'll be happy to take any questions by email. Yes, the slides the presentation is available to download. I will send the link, after this presentation, right?
We have already put in the PDF link in the thank you email, so you will receive the thank you emails tomorrow. It's already scheduled out. Yeah.
Right. So while Angie does that, I've pasted the link right now for you, Sridhar, so you can just take it right away, right? While the email, before the email reaches you. So the link is there. Are there any questions? If you raised your hand, I'll try to unmute you. Thank you, Edgardo. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you, Christopher. No worries. Thank you, Imran. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you, Ranjan. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Raza. Yeah, feel free to email me. Feel free to, thank you, Salim. Yeah, thank you so much. Right. Thanks, Steven. Oh, Steven, I still owe you a reply. I'll call you after this call. Sorry, man.
Hi, so I think Mustaq has raised her hand. I have unmuted, but I think he just left. Okay.
Oh, okay.
I've unmuted Mumtaz. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself.
Yeah, just unmute yourself. The control is in your hand. I'll hang around for a couple of more minutes. Okay, thank you, Mohammed. Goodbye, everyone. Okay, thank you so much. I want to thank you again for spending an hour with me. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you, Rajan. Goodbye. I hope to catch you. Just add me on LinkedIn or wherever you want. Shoot me questions. No problem. Happy to help you. Okay. Thank you, Mercy. Have a great day. Bye-bye.